Okay, so welcome back to another edition of Jason Doing Philosophy. Today's lecture on John Stuart Mill is going to do double duty. It's going to be the lecture that I post both for my ethics class and for my Intro to Philosophy class. So some of the things that I say, at least at the beginning of this lecture, are going to seem a little bit familiar to my people who took my ethics class. Just bear with me. It'll be a little bit of a review. Okay, so we're studying philosophy, and we are in an ethics class. We are going to be talking about ethics for the entire semester. In my Intro to Philosophy class, we're going to begin with ethics. Ethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with questions about good and bad and right and wrong. Right. So. And today, for both classes, we are going to talk about the philosophy of John Stuart Mill and his presentation of utilitarianism. So, let's begin here. Let's back up a step. Let's back up to the most general kind of question that you can ask about the field of ethics, the question about good and bad and right and wrong. And that question is, are there moral facts? Are there truths to be known about morality at all? Or when I say that it's okay to kill people and hurt children and keep slaves, I'm just expressing an opinion, and when you say those things are wrong, you're just expressing a contrary opinion, and we just have to agree to disagree. On the other hand, there are people who think that no, it is a fact that killing innocent people, torturing people, etc., genocide, these things are stealing, morally wrong, and that's just a fact. So, let's begin here with the question, are there moral facts? There are, as I've said previously, at least two ways to answer this question. No and yes. So, if you answer no to this question, if you answer no to this question, you say there are no moral facts. So when people make moral claims, when they express ideas about morality and say some things are good and some things are bad, they're really just expressing their personal opinions, and they're just expressing their preferences. You know, when I say that it's wrong to kill people, I'm just expressing a preference that people don't kill around me, right? We may be having an issue.
No,
technical issue. It just flashed the screen. Okay, never mind. Anyway, now, in my ethics class, we talked previously about the most popular or most influential variety of ethical subjectivism. That is
now you're having
cultural.
Technical issues.
Now I'm having technical issues. That is cultural relativism. If you, in my intro to philosophy class, if you're fascinated by ethical subjectivism, I highly recommend that you take my ethics class, which is available in the fall. Who knows if we'll be meeting in person. But I will be teaching it as far as I know. And we say a little bit more about answering no to this question. Now, the real interesting answer to this question, of course, is yes, to say that there are moral facts. There are moral truths. Because if you say, yes, there are moral facts, there are moral truths, then you have to answer the much more difficult question of, well, okay, what are those moral facts? And if I think that the moral facts are that, generally it's wrong to kill people, but not to kill people of other races or the people who live across the river or so on and so forth, we have serious moral disputes, and you think that it is a moral fact that it's wrong to kill all people, well, how do you convince me, the moral skeptic? So what we are going to talk about over the next few classes we are going to talk a variety of ways of answering yes to this question. People who answer yes to this question, they have their own name. They are called moral realists. So, the yes answer to this question qualifies you as a moral realism. That means you are a realist about morality. You think that claims about morality are either true or false, and that we can know the fact of the matter about whether or not it's wrong to kill, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to keep slaves, and so on. Now, moral realism will be the focus of the next few classes. So let's get into it. Let's talk about a few varieties of moral realism. I'm going to lay out a landscape now of a few approaches to moral realism that will be a kind of sign of things to come over the next few readings that you do, no matter which class you're in. So let's get into moral realism. Pause this for a moment. Okay. So we are going to talk over the next week about 3 approaches to moral realism, 3 approaches to the position that there are moral facts and that we can know what the moral facts are, right? 3 ways of answering the question, well, what are the moral facts and how do you convince me if I disagree? So, here are the 3 approaches to moral realism as we will be talking about. Okay, so in the first case, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list. There might be other approaches, but there are 3 approaches. These are generally considered the 3 major approaches, and these are the ones most importantly we're going to be discussing. So in the first case, there is the position called consequentialism. Consequentialism is an approach to moral decision-making that says, well, an act is good if it has good consequences, and it's bad if it has bad consequences. So it doesn't get much simpler than that. The consequentialist, here in parentheses under each of these, I have written down what the approach emphasizes or considers most basic. The consequentialist emphasizes outcomes, real-world outcomes. Did something have good consequences? And if it did, then it's a good action. They emphasize, as their name implies, consequences. And the consequentialists tend to employ slogans like "the ends justify the means." If you've ever heard anybody say "the ends justify the means," first of all, watch your back. But secondly, that person is endorsing a position of consequentialism, right? That slogan, by the way, was coined by a very famous, very ruthless consequentialist named Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli, not the best, not the proudest example of the field of consequentialism, right? So so the consequentialist is going to be, and by the way, all of these different positions, these are very broad positions, so there might be lots and lots of different philosophers and lots of different subgroups within each of these positions. There might be lots of different kinds of, and there are lots of different kinds of consequentialists and lots of different kinds of the others, right? Okay, so these are going to be very broad positions, right? So, now, when I say consequentialist says an act is good if it has good consequences and bad if it has bad if it has bad consequences, you might say to yourself, well, now wait a second, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because, I might do something for the right reasons, and through no fault of my own, just because of my bad luck or somebody else's bad luck, it has bad consequences, right? And it seems like we shouldn't morally praise or blame people for things over which they have no control, right? Well, if you are sympathetic to that point of view and that critique of consequentialism, perhaps you are going to be more sympathetic to the second on this list, and that is deontology. Deontology, a philosopher's term. You don't hear about that a lot. You don't hear that word deontology a lot outside of the area of philosophy. But it comes from the Greek. It means the study of duty, of moral duty, right? And that is what the deontologist emphasizes. The deontologist says that that consequences, being out of our control, have not a thing in the world to do with whether or not an act is morally good or bad. The truth of the matter is, the deontologist says, that we as human beings have certain kinds of moral duties towards each other. And when we fulfill our moral duties, we have done good. And if we don't fulfill our moral duties, we've done bad. And if bad consequences result from me doing my moral duty, well, that doesn't make any difference, right? Notice the difference here. For a consequentialist, right, I might do something. That seems good. Somebody, a friend of mine, let's say, says, "Hey, I really need some money for rent this month. I'm short. I lost my job," right? And so I lend my friend $100. Unbeknownst to me, my friend has recently developed a drug habit and spends all of his all the money that I gave him, not on rent but on heroin. Gets a bad batch, shoots up and dies. Right now, I did a good act. It seemed like I did something charitable, but through no fault of my own, my good act had bad consequences. Right. Do we say then that lending money to your friends is a bad idea or a morally bad thing to do? Well, if we're a strict consequentialist, maybe, right? At the very least, you should be more responsible about doing due diligence about where your money is going, right? The deontologist, however, says that doesn't make any sense. The truth is you fulfilled your duty to help your friend out. Your friend did something bad that has absolutely nothing to do with you. It's very, very sad. You should have helped your friend if you could, but you didn't get that opportunity. Now your friend's dead. You feel bad, but life happens. So deontologists think that the major reason to study the field of ethics is to try to figure out what our moral duties are, and to try to figure out what our rights are. Deontologists tend to emphasize not just our duties, but also our rights. We have certain rights as human beings because of duties, and we should never violate certain rights. And it doesn't make any difference to the deontologist, by the way, what the consequences are. You may never violate your duties. You may never, ever, not even one time, violate somebody's rights. It doesn't make any difference what the consequences are. They tend to be extremists about this, right? So if sacrificing one person is going to save 1 million lives, but it's going to require you violating that person's rights, well, too bad for those millions of people. You may never, not even once, violate that person's rights. Another important area of dispute between consequentialists and deontologists is over the issue of intentions. As you might imagine, consequentialists, very concerned about real-world outcomes and real-world consequences, don't really care about your intentions. You might do something that has good intentions, like giving your friend some money, and your friend goes out and blows it on drugs, and something bad happens. Well, the consequentialist isn't concerned about your intentions. The deontologist, however, is very concerned about your intentions. If your intentions were to do your duty, to preserve people's rights, to do good, then your action is good, period. We don't have to know anything else. We don't have to know about how your friend spent his money. We don't have to know anything else about the world. Doesn't matter what happens. Your act was good once and for all because it was done with good intentions out of a sense of duty. Great. So, okay. So for a long time, 75 years or so, in the late 1800s, if you picked up a philosophical journal and you read about philosophical ethics, you were going to be exposed to a lot of debates between different versions of consequentialism and different versions of deontology. By the turn of the 20th century, there are lots of different kinds of consequentialism sprouting up all over. The various versions of consequentialism are very, very hostile towards each other in some cases. They're calling each other all sorts of crazy names. And the deontologists, for their part, they've split up into some different factions too. But they're generally okay with each other. But they're very hostile, obviously, to the two consequentialists who they think are running the world, right? But the bottom line is, at the turn of the 20th century, the kind of height of a kind of new golden age of moral philosophy. One particular version of consequentialism we'll talk about shortly versus deontology is sort of those are the major camps that are fighting it out in philosophical ethics. But wait, there's more. In about the middle part of the 20th century, there begins to be a revival. Thanks to writers like Philippa Foot and Elizabeth Abscom, there begins to be a revival of a very old-fashioned kind of philosophy that dates back thousands of years to the Greeks. And this has become sort of the third rail in this conversation, and it's known as, in the modern era, virtue ethics, right? Virtue ethics has a very different approach than the other two approaches to moral realism. The virtue ethicist says that the consequentialists and the deontologists both make the same mistake. The consequentialists and the deontologists, what they both really want is they want one rule or one procedure that's going to tell me in every case what the right thing to do is, right? So, should I steal money from my employer? Let's say I'm in a position, I'm a banker, I work for a very old man, and he's totally at my mercy to control his funds. Now, my mother needs an operation, and I don't have the money to get that operation for her. I know that I can get away with stealing, let's say, $10,000 from this old banker. Should I do it? Right? Well, as you can see, the consequentialist and the deontologist both have a very clear procedure for arriving at the answer to this very specific question in this very specific circumstance. The deontologist, of course, says, no, you should never, ever, not even once, steal from people, because stealing is wrong. And the consequentialist is more likely to say something like, well, hey, the banker is never going to miss the money. Your mom's life is more important than the bottom line of the bank book. So maybe you should go ahead and steal the money, right? So consequentialists and deontologists, they come up with procedures that get very clear answers to very specific questions. Virtue ethicists say, well, this totally misunderstands what moral decision-making really is. Moral decision-making is not really about a decision procedure to tell me in specific cases what to do every time. Instead, what we should concentrate on, for the virtue ethicist says, is we should concentrate on, well, what is a good person? What is a noble person? What is an admirable person? What kind of character traits do we admire in other people? What kind of character traits are we attracted to? And I don't mean necessarily romantically, but just what kind of people do we want to be around? What kind of people do we want to fill our lives with? So the virtue ethicist is going to say, forget about any sort of decision procedure that is going to give you the right answer in every particular circumstance. Instead, concentrate on what kind of person you want to be and what kind of people, what kind of character traits you admire in others. So they're going to emphasize things like character, excellence, and noble examples, right? For the virtue ethicist, we should ask ourselves, instead of asking ourselves, well, what's more important, respecting people's rights or promoting happiness, we should ask ourselves, well, what kind of people do we want to be? Who do we admire? Think of a person you admire, whether it's your father or an uncle or your mother or your karate instructor or somebody, and ask yourself, well, what would that person do in this particular circumstance, right? And that is the virtue ethical approach. So this is going to be a preview of the next the next couple of weeks of your life. We are one by one going to go through 3 different approaches, go through philosophers who represent these 3 different approaches to moral decision making. Okay, so with that in mind, normally what I do now is I say to my class, I clap my hands and I say, wake up, right? once awoken, I asked them, okay, so we read for today John Stuart Mill. You suffered through it. And having suffered through it, hopefully you got something out of it. So answer me this. Where do we think John Stuart Mill belongs in this taxonomy? Do we think that John Stuart Mill is a consequentialist who emphasizes outcomes? Do we think he's a deontologist who emphasizes duties? Or do we think he's a virtue ethicist who emphasizes things like good moral character and good examples? Chew on that for a second while I grab the beverage. Okay, did you think about it long enough? Well, if you said John Stuart Mill is a consequentialist, you get a gold star. I'll mail it to you. Yes, John Stuart Mill for today is going to represent the most important, most influential version of consequentialism, called utilitarianism. Now, before we leave consequentialism, as I said, it's a very broad sort of position. It encompasses lots of different philosophies. But you might have noticed consequentialism, as I laid it out, is a little too broad to be terribly helpful in our decision making, right? So, I say, an act is good if it has good consequences. It's bad if it has bad consequences. Well, we might ask ourselves, well, what in the world do we mean by good consequences, right? And taken that generally, consequentialism gives us no help at all. We can imagine a philosophy, a version of consequentialism that says that, an act is good if it results in there being more goats in the state of Missouri. And so we are justified in doing absolutely anything we can to get more goats in the state of Missouri. So we drive over to Illinois, we raid some goat farms, we steal some goats, we drive them, road warrior style back into Missouri, killing anybody who gets in our way. But at the end of it all, there are 500 more goats in the state of Missouri, and so we've done good, right? Well, no, that's silly. That would be a very frivolous, very implausible version of consequentialism, but a version of consequentialism nonetheless, right? And that's very whimsical and sort of silly, but there are lots of consequentialist approaches in the real world that are basically as silly, right? I mean, when you talk especially about certain kinds of nationalism that talk about, anything that's good for the interests of for instance, the United States or Canada or Mexico, anything that is good for the interests of those countries is a justifiable act. Well, you can imagine that is a little less whimsical and seems a little ominous, right? But there are people all over the world, both in the United States, especially in the United States military, but in all sorts of militaries around the world who are perfectly willing to justify all sorts of terrible, heinous actions just by saying, well, it's in it's in the interest of country X, right? So what we need a plausible, non-controversial version of consequentialism. And we need to answer the question, well, what do we mean by a good consequence? And here is where John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians come in. So, okay. Again, what we need is a version of consequentialism that is not entirely whimsical or frivolous, and that's where John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians come in. John Stuart Mill promotes a philosophy called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a moral philosophy that's based on the principle of utility, hence the name. The principle of utility says an act is good to the degree that it promotes happiness and bad to the degree that it promotes misery. So forget about goats in the state of Missouri. Instead, what we have now is we have a philosophy that says that yes, an act is good if it has good consequences, but by good consequences, we mean happiness, right? Particularly human happiness. Now, this is a little helpful, but we still run into a bit of a problem here about this word happiness, right? What is happiness? Well, this is one of the oldest questions in the field in philosophy, and lots of different people have given lots of different arguments about what happiness is. As we'll see in a few see next week, Aristotle is going to have a very different idea. He's going to say that happiness is very important to moral decision making, but he's going to have a very different idea of what happiness is. So, what Mill needs, if he's going to make utilitarianism fly, he's going to need a definition of happiness that doesn't seem entirely controversial or crazy. So, and his definition of happiness actually is very, very simple and straightforward. What does Mill mean by happiness? Well, it's very easy. Okay, I'm back. Mill's definition of happiness, very simply, is pleasure. We all understand what pleasure is. It's pleasant sensations, pleasant emotions. Even if you think there is no pleasure in life, you know what pain is, and not being in less pain is better than being in more pain. So Mill thinks, very simply, you can kind of step aside the sort of deep philosophical quagmire over the definition of happiness simply by defining happiness as pleasure. Now, this idea that happiness is pleasure is not unique to John Stuart Mill. It actually goes way back in philosophy, as most things do. Most issues in philosophy go back to the Greeks. And actually, this idea that all there is to human happiness is pleasure has its own name. That name is hedonism, right? Now, you might have heard this word hedonism used in English. If you are described as a hedonist, this is not a compliment. Hedonism in English is often used to describe somebody who is addicted to the pleasures of the flesh, to eating a lot, to doing a lot of drugs, to having a lot of sex, and so on, the things normally associated with pleasures of the flesh, right? In fact, you may be familiar with there's a chain of hotels in Jamaica and other places in the Caribbean called Hedonism, 1, 2, and 3, right? And they have a reputation as being a place where 20-somethings with lots of disposable income come to have the time of their lives, spend a lot of money, and have wild, incredible parties, right? Abandoning any sort of traditional sense of, decorum or good taste, right? So the word hedonism in English is again not a compliment. Furthermore, John Stuart Mill is writing in the middle part of the 1800s. This is the era known as the Victorian era, because of the queen of the time was Queen Victoria. You may be familiar with the Victorian era. You may have heard it referenced in some, a period piece or a movie. You might have heard referred to it in another class, taking a class on history. Maybe you've heard about it in a psychology class. Freud scandalized the Victorian era with a lot of his theories about psychology. Anyway, the Victorian era is well known for being, back in England in the 1800s, people were very, very uptight about pleasure, particularly sex, right? It was not polite. In fact, it was very, very impolite and improper to talk about sex, and this idea that somebody would equate happiness with pleasure was frankly scandalous, right? And it cast John Stuart Mill's whole philosophy here of utilitarianism in a very bad light, and made it very, very controversial. But Mill, following in the tradition of his mentor, another utilitarian philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, fully embraced the controversy. It only brought him, more notoriety, right? But there's a problem lurking here, a philosophical problem. We don't have to be Victorian era fuddy-duddies to notice the problem. Consider this. Happiness is pleasure. All there is to human happiness is pleasure. Everything that human beings have ever done, from eating a Snickers bar to putting a man on the moon to getting a PhD to having children, all of these things are just some sort of pursuit of pleasure. Doesn't make sense to a lot of people. The bigger problem is this. So, if all there is to happiness is pleasure, well, I can just cross out the word happiness in this definition of the principle of utility, and I can just write in pleasure. Right? As I just did. So, now the principle of utility reads, an act is good to the degree it promotes pleasure and bad to the degree it promotes misery, or the opposite of pleasure, right? Pain, right? So, let's say that this is as far as I read John Stuart Mill. That he lays this out in the first couple pages of his article. Let's say that I am thoroughly convinced by this, and I say, I'm a utilitarian. I slam the book shut, or I slam my laptop shut if you're reading this online, right? And I say, okay, so I have a moral responsibility to be promoting pleasure as much as possible. That is my sole moral obligation in life, right? So, what do you need to have pleasure? Well, it helps to have money, right? I don't have a lot of money. This job doesn't pay as well as you probably think it does. So I need money. Well, where does the money live? Well, the money lives at the bank, right? So I need some of the money from the bank. So let's say I go to my bank. I write on a piece of paper. I have a bomb. Fill this bag with money. I pass it to the teller. The teller fills the bag with money. What do you get on a score like that? Probably like $5,000. So I take that money, and let's say I go over to the casinos over in Illinois, and I have a grand old time. I guess there's some in Missouri, but the good ones are in Illinois. And you go over there. You have a really great, I have a really great time. I'm working on my blackjack system. I'm throwing around money, right? I'm winning a little bit. I'm very generous with other people's money, and I'm having a great old time. I'm creating an awful lot of pleasure. So, does this mean that we, if we're going to be good utilitarians, we have a moral responsibility to rob a bank and go spend the money creating pleasure for ourselves? Well, the answer, no surprise, is no. If the answer were yes, we would not be talking about John Stuart Mill here, over 100 years later. The problem is this. That when the utilitarians say that they are for promoting for promoting happiness, they don't just mean happiness for one person, for you. Mill says that we utilitarians, we mean creating the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Talking about creating happiness generally, right? So, we have to consider in my little bank robbery and trip over to the east side. We have to consider how much total happiness and misery is created by my actions, and here's where things get a little more complicated. Okay, so In analyzing whether or not an act is good or bad, according to utilitarianism, we have to look at not just the happiness created for one person, but the total happiness created for everybody, right? Everybody involved in the scheme. So I get a vote, right? But I also have to consider the happiness or misery created for the people around me. So consider this. Let's say that there's me. I get, let's say, plus 100 happiness points. Now, this seems a little strange and whimsical, but in fact, utilitarians and economists do talk about happiness points. So just bear with me. So I get 100 points of just being thrilled with the excitement of robbing a bank and the excitement of going over and working on my blackjack system and having a great old time, right? I get a lot of fun out of that, right? Now, who else is involved in my scheme? Well, as a lot of my students would be pointing out if they were here right now, well, what about the bank teller, right? The bank teller is afraid for her life, right? After she's been, she's never been robbed before. She's terrified that she's going to be killed. Afterwards, she's terrified that she didn't follow proper bank procedure. She has to go through all the rigmarole with her supervisors, with the police, and so on. Maybe she has post-traumatic stress afterwards, and so on and so forth. So let's say that she suffers negative 100 happiness points. She's made miserable to the tune of negative 100 happiness points. I'm going to keep these numbers simple because my greatest fear in life is doing math in public. So now, it would appear, if we stop here, that my action is a push, right? I have created some joy, but I've offset it by creating misery. But wait. Consider, for instance, the other bank employees. They're also stressed out, let's say to the tune of negative 50 happiness points. They have to go through all sorts of new training procedures. They have to talk again to the police. It's all very stressful for them. Now, let's talk about the police action. Let's say the police have to come and they have to investigate this crime. Let's say there's two detectives. It is their job, but nonetheless, it's stressful to them. If you've ever watched The Wire, you know how police officers stress about open cases on their books. So let's say there's two police officers. They're both stressed out to the tune of 25 happiness points. So total, that's negative 50 happiness points. Already, we're in the black. Do you see what's happening? Now, some of my students at this point will point out, no, wait a second. But what about other people that might have been made happy by the money I was throwing around? What about, the croupiers and the waitresses and everybody else over at the casino? Well, good point. We have to take them into account too. So let's say that all the casino workers, the casino workers and dancers and so on, they all told, again, I'm very generous with other people's money. So let's say that all told, they're made happy to another 100 happiness points. Right. Now, okay, so 100, 100, 100. So now we're at a push again, right? But wait. Now, let's say that, the bank I robbed, say I robbed my own bank. It's here in Afton. It's the Commerce Bank here in Afton. I probably shouldn't say that. But anyway, let's say I robbed my own bank. This is a brazen bank robbery in the middle of the day. And it makes it on the news. And everybody in the area of Afton, the quiet little suburb that I live in, everybody in Afton becomes just a little bit concerned that the crime rate is going up and their property values are going down. Now, it doesn't have to be a lot, but let's just all say they lose 1 point of happiness at the stress where am I? At the stress of seeing this this bank having been robbed, right? But let's say there's 3,000 people in the city of Afton. Well, this creates a huge problem. See how the numbers get skewed here? Even though we had a push up until now, if the entire community is stressed out by my action, then that means that that my bank robbery has in effect robbed the universe of 3,000 happiness points. It has created 3,000 points of misery. And that number remains. That giant number hangs out there. And there's very little that I can do about it. Now, it's important to note that from a utilitarian perspective, the size of that number is what makes things like robbing banks very seriously morally wrong, right? Robbing banks, even though they make a few people happy, right, they tend to make a lot of people very miserable, and that's why the very famous sorts of acts of criminality that we talk about, robbing banks, killing people, genocide, kidnapping, and ransom and all these things, even though they make a few people happy, possibly, they tend to make everybody very, very unhappy and very, very stressed out, if not emotionally fraught. Right. So that is, to the utilitarian, what makes things like robbing banks very seriously morally wrong. So, now, often a student at this point would say something like this. Say, now wait a second. What if I didn't just blow all that money at the casino, not the casino workers? What if I did some good with it, right? Don't we have to take that into account? This is a great point. So imagine this scenario. Imagine that I go over to I get that ill-gotten money, and I go over to the casino, and I try out my blackjack system, and I'm going like crazy, and I'm hitting, I'm doing it really, really well. And all of a sudden, I turn $5,000 into $25,000, and $25,000 into $100,000, and then bear with me. I know by then they kick me out of the local casino. But then let's say I hit it big, and I end up making millions of dollars, right? And then I have a change of heart. Then I realize, now wait a second. I need to change my life. I need to do something differently. God has given me this money, and I need to do some good with it. So what do I do with it? Well, I go out and I start a charity. I start a charity that helps orphans in Haiti, or I start a charity that helps Syrian refugees, right? I do some good with it. I really genuinely do some good with it. I save over the next few. I save a lot of lives over the next few years. A lot of kids who would have gone hungry don't go hungry because of my money, right? Do we then want to say that robbing the bank was not wrong? I mean, if good came out of it, then maybe there's a utilitarian argument that robbing, that instance anyway of robbing a bank wasn't wrong. And there is a utilitarian argument that maybe if that's what we're going to do with robbing the bank, with the money we get from robbing a bank, maybe it isn't so bad. Mill's response, though, is a lot more nuanced. Mill would point out that, now wait a second, earthquake. Now wait a second, is the only way to start that Syrian refugee fund by robbing the bank? If there's another way to get that money without creating all of this misery, then you have a moral obligation to do it that way rather than this way, right? You should always create the greatest good for the greatest number. That's another way of stating the principle of utility. An act is good to the degree it promotes happiness, it's bad to the degree it promotes misery, and we should always do the greatest good for the greatest number, right? This prevents us, from Mill's perspective, from frivolously sacrificing the interests and the happiness of people just because we want to do a greater good. We should do a greater good while at the same time creating as little unhappiness and misery as possible. So, if there's a way to start a Haitian relief fund or a Syrian refugee fund or help some other charity like that without creating all this misery, we have a moral obligation to do it that way rather than this way. Now, 2 asterisks on that. One is that, well, if you've already robbed the bank and you made a bad moral decision, the best you can't go back in time. The best you can do with that money, from Mill's perspective, is go out and start that Syrian relief fund. You can do some good with it, right? That doesn't make robbing banks okay, but at least it's something. At least it helps to make amends, right? And this is where I think he agrees with a few other moral theories, right? The other asterisk here, the other sort of footnote on this issue is, if there is another way to get that money, then we have without creating happiness, then we have an obligation to do it that way. Now, that might be a big if. If you live in a society that is hopelessly corrupt, if you live in a society where money that is given to charity is taken by corrupt politicians or warlords and used for bad things, and you desperately want to help people in the community, but you can't get money to them any other way, and taxes are high, you're constantly being shaken down by these corrupt politicians. Anyway, your society is totally messed up. There's no way to help other people except by maybe robbing a bank. If you're really in that situation and there's no other way to help, Mill would say go for it, right? If the only way, if through no fault of your own, your society is so screwed up and so corrupt that there's no other way to help those people than by, in effect, playing Robin Hood, then, he's down with that. Go for it. He gives an example of, the sort of famous dilemma of the woman who can't feed her child. Her baby is starving to death. But there is a shop that's closed, and all she has to do is throw a brick through the window and steal milk for her child, right? Is she justified in stealing the milk? And from Mill's perspective, well, she needs to be honest with herself, totally honest with herself about whether or not there's any other way to get the milk. But if there isn't, throw the damn brick, right? It's the life of the child is obviously more important than the cost of the picture when you're at Walgreens, right? Again, not to pick on Walgreens. I should have said CVS. Sorry. So, yes. So we have dealt with the first and foremost primary objection to utilitarianism and its adoptance of hedonism, the idea that happiness is pleasure. We have dispensed then, Mill thinks, with the idea that utilitarianism can be used just to justify people going out on crime sprees to satisfy themselves. It's not just about your happiness, it's about the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay. Okay. So, next, we're going to deal with another objection that was raised against utilitarianism at the time of Mill, and it goes back again to what I was saying before about the Victorian era, right? Everybody around most people at this time are very, very suspicious of anything having to do with pleasure, particularly pleasures of the flesh. And the idea of hedonism, the idea that hedonism, all there is to happiness is pleasure, is a scandalous notion in this era. And a common objection goes this way, as I said before, everything that human beings do then is just out of a pursuit of some kind of pleasure. If that's true, Mill's critics say, then people are no better than pigs. I mean, we're no better than just animals wallowing around in the mud looking for the next treat, right? And everything that we do, again, from astrophysics to having children to eating a candy bar, everything is really just this pursuit of this basic pursuit of pleasure, and we're really just animals, right? So Mill wants to address this question, right? And this question can be stated like this: by adopting hedonism, is utilitarianism degrading to human beings? That is it a doctrine worthy only of swine? Swine being a poetic term for pigs, right? By saying that all there is to human happiness is pleasure, or we're really just saying that people are no better than pigs, right? Now, to give it a little historical context for this, as I made mention earlier, John Stuart Mill's mentor was a man named Jeremy Bentham, who was a major utilitarian philosopher. He's sort of the godfather of modern utilitarianism. And Bentham laid a lot of the groundwork for utilitarianism in the early 1800s, and he's before Mill comes along and causes his own sort of controversies. Bentham is the most famous name associated with utilitarianism. Bentham, for his part, is more than happy to say that, well, yes, utilitarianism does mean that we're no better than animals wallowing around looking for the next treat. Bentham said there are no higher pursuits. He has this very famous slogan where he says, very famous phrase where he says, pushpin is as good as poetry, right? What is pushpin? Nobody's really sure what it was. It was some sort of bar game. Anyway, ways of wasting your time, if you enjoy them, if they bring you pleasure, whether it's playing some bar game or drinking yourself stupid or playing Candy Crush on your phone for 8 hours a day or any of the other ways of entertaining yourself, those are no better or worse than reading poetry or reading philosophy or reading some great book or seeing some great movie. Bentham was said that he was no one to judge which pleasure was better than another, right? In fact, he goes so far as to say, hey, if dumb little pursuits like playing Candy Crush, you didn't know about Candy Crush, let's just take that as an example, if dumb little pursuits like playing Candy Crush or playing some little bar game bring more joy to people because lots and lots of people get pleasure in them, then maybe they're better than poetry, right? Maybe they're better than reading philosophy, right? So as you can imagine, I'm already sort of painted a picture of the sort of kind of sociological context of Victorian England at the time. This proves to be, very, very scandalous, right? Here's where John Stuart Mill is going to make a name for himself. He's going to break off from his mentor, Jeremy Bentham, strike out on his own ground, and in fact invent his own wing of utilitarianism. And it has to do with this question of whether or not, by adopting hedonism, utilitarianism is a doctrine worthy only of pigs, and if it's degrading to human beings. Here, Mill says, well, no, it's not degrading to human beings. In fact, it is my opponents who ask this question, who are degrading human beings, because it is my opponents who believe that what brings pleasure to a pig is going to bring pleasure to a human being. And Mill here says, well, the truth of the matter is that there are different kinds of pleasure. There are different ways of measuring pleasure. And some kinds of pleasure are just better than other kinds of pleasure, right? Contrary to what Bentham said, and people like Bentham said, there are higher and lower kinds of pleasure, and the higher pleasures are just more valuable than even larger quantities of lower pleasures, right? How exactly does this work? Well, it's So I should say I should point out that this is a very controversial position that Mill takes. It's very controversial within philosophy generally, and it's very controversial even among his fellow utilitarians. But it makes a certain kind of intuitive sense, right? It seems like there are different kinds of pleasures, and that some of them are just better than others. I like Snickers bars. I already mentioned them once in this lecture. They're on my mind. It's that time of eating where I'm getting hungry, right? I'd love to have a Snickers bar right now. Now, if I eat a Snickers bar, I get pleasure from that. It's joy. It's satisfying to me. It's their slogan, right? Now, here's where it helps to have students present. At this point, I say, now who here has children? Who has a child, right? And several of my students raise their hands, right? And say, I don't have children. This is a true story. I, Jason, don't have any children. But I hear from parents that there's a great amount of joy that they experience the first time that they lay eyes on their newborn child, right? So I ask a parent in my class. I say, okay, so I don't have any children, but I've eaten a lot of Snickers bars, right? So think about that moment when you first laid your eyes on your firstborn child and the joy that you felt in that moment. How many Snickers bars would it take to equal that moment of joy that you had, right? And normally at this point they laugh in my face. And I take that to mean, what, like 100, right? 100 Snickers bars equals the joy of seeing your child for the first time? No, this is silly. Some might say stupid. You can't, pleasures just aren't fungible in that way, right? When we're talking about the difference between pleasures of the flesh, like eating a Snickers bar or having a really good cookie, you just can't compare that to the sorts of joys that people experience when they have children, when they achieve some great accomplishment in life, when they get their dream job and so on, right? That some pleasures are just better than others. Now, Mill, as a hedonist, says, well, now wait a second, it's all pleasure, it's all joy, it's all connected in some way. But the truth of the matter is there are just some pleasures that are better than others, right? And it is these higher pleasures that distinguish human pursuits from animal pursuits. Now, let's go back to the example of the pig. We talked earlier about whether or not hedonism reduces people to the level of pigs. Now, we all know, you're hopefully familiar with pigs. Maybe you've read about them. Maybe this is a pig farm. I don't know. But imagine, right? So we all know that there are some pleasures that a pig can experience that a human being can experience, right? And we all know that there are just a few things that bring a pig pleasure, right? So let's think about some of the pig pleasures. What are some of the things that bring a pig pleasure? Well, pigs like to eat a lot, right? Pigs like to lay around in the mud. They like to wallow around in the mud. They like to they like to sleep a lot, right? And they spend some time making little piggies. Anyway, we might think of, maybe half a dozen to a dozen activities that bring a pig joy, right? Now, if you want a happier pig, all you can do is give it more time eating, more time laying around in the sun, more time making little piggies, and so on, right? That's all there is to a pig's life. Now, compare that to a person. Human beings have a whole universe of different kinds of activities that can bring us joy, right? And there's a taxonomy of these joys. Some of these joys are very basic. Some of these pleasures are very basic. Some of them are loftier, and some of them are the highest sorts of accomplishments people can attain, right? So what emerges is a kind of scale. So at the bottom of the scale, we'll put the pig pleasures. These are pleasures that both pigs and human beings can enjoy. There are certainly some activities that both that both pigs and people can take some pleasure in. So imagine this scenario. Imagine you're working hard all week. These taking classes in this format is very taxing. Maybe you have children. Congratulations on the joy of parenthood. Maybe a lot of people are also hold on a day job while they do this. So your life right now might be, the plague that is inconveniencing all of us right now, creating a lot of stress for everybody. A lot of people are very, very stressed out by now between work, parenthood, and school and COVID. Very, very stressful time, right? So imagine this. Imagine that you unexpectedly this weekend, say your significant other or your spouse decides, I'm going to take the kids out of town and go see my parents, right? Also, turns out you're off for the weekend for your job unexpectedly, right? So all of a sudden, you have 3 days off, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Right? After a very stressful couple of weeks, you all of a sudden have nothing to do, right? And you think to yourself, you know what I'm going to do with my 3 days off? I'm going to do nothing. I'm just going to lay there. I'm just going to totally recharge my batteries. I'm just going to veg out, as they say, right? So you will be, and maybe you get a big bag of your favorite candy, hopefully Snickers, but maybe you're a Twix person, who knows. Anyway, and so whenever you get hungry, you're just going to reach over and shovel some candy in your face. But you're totally going to, again, veg out and recharge all your batteries, right? And just sleep and sleep and sleep as much as you can. So, and in the midst of this, you are going to take pleasure in some of the things that a pig can take pleasure in, like sleeping in all day, like eating fatty foods and so on, right? Proving the point that there are some pleasures that both pigs and human beings can both take joy in, right? So now, what's going to happen? Well, I'm a lazy person myself. I'm a real sleeper inner, right? I really like to sleep in. And I can speak from experience here that when you decide you're going to sleep in all weekend, something happens. Maybe you make it to about, 3 p.m. on Saturday, but eventually you get bored, right, with just the pig pleasures, right? So what do? Well, you need more stimulation, so maybe you turn on the TV, right? You haven't even turned on the TV at this point. I'm telling you, you're totally vegging out. You're just going to sleep. But now you're bored, so you're like, I don't know, maybe I'm going to turn on the TV or maybe play a video game or something like that. Now, turning on the television is not the greatest achievement of a human being, but the joy you get in watching TV is not the kind of joy that it's not the sort of thing that a pig can take pleasure in. So the joy of watching TV is just a little bit higher in quality than laying around doing nothing like a pig, right? So drawing our scale here, and this will go all the way up. So what we see here is Down at the very bottom, there are the pig pleasures. These are pleasures that both human beings and pigs can take some joy in. And just a notch higher is watching TV or playing some video games. Right? We're not talking about good video games that maybe really engage your mind, but just Pong or something, right? So yeah, just something to to occupy your mind. Yes, so maybe, but watching TV or playing video games is not going to entertain you for long. You continue to get bored. You need more and more stimulation. In particular, you need more and more mental stimulation. So maybe you read a book. Maybe you hang out with friends. Maybe you watch a movie, a good movie, not just some movie that numbs your mind, but actually engages your intellect and so on, right? But these activities are all going out of focus. These activities are all going to engage more and more of your higher faculties, right? And they're going to give you different kinds of pleasure, right? The pleasure you get from just laying around eating food is a different kind of pleasure than still pleasure, but it's a different kind of pleasure you get from watching TV or hanging out with friends or watching a movie, right? And Mill thinks that one essential characteristic of the pleasures, the increasing quality of pleasures as we go up the scale, is that the higher quality the pleasure, the more it's going to involve your higher faculty and your intellect, right? So it requires a refinement of your intellect and your good taste and so on to really appreciate a good book or to hanging out with friends or seeing a movie, right? So we can extend this scale up to the sort of highest accomplishments that human beings are capable of, right? Here's where I normally take a poll and have my students say, well, what are the highest things that people are capable of accomplishing in life? This tells me something about my students. But I will just give you now some of the things they say. They say getting a dream job, right? They will say things. I invite them to be maybe even more ambitious, like the highest things that anybody is capable of doing. Somebody might say, creating some great art, like writing a great novel, directing a great movie, something like that, winning a Nobel Prize, etc. Reading philosophy, highest accomplishment in life.
That's not a thing.
Please, no comments from the peanut gallery. Anyway, so the scale goes all the way up to the greatest kinds of accomplishments that we can attain in life, right? Now, a couple things to point out here is Mill thinks that the emotions associated with all of these things are pleasure, they're joy, they're happiness, right? But he thinks that there are just different brands of happiness and joy associated with these different kinds of accomplishments, right? And you just can't compare the time you spent playing video games and watching TV to the joy that you experience at winning a Nobel Prize or getting your dream job or something like that, right? And so to this he says, or to this objection that happiness or that hedonism reduces people to the level of swine, his point is, well, when my opponents talk about pleasure, they're really talking about pleasure. They're just thinking of pleasures of the flesh. And pleasures of the flesh, Mill's got nothing against the pleasures of the flesh, but he thinks they're just naturally inferior to the pleasures of the mind, to the pleasures of the intellect, to the pleasure that comes along with setting a goal and attaining some long-term accomplishment, right? These sorts of things are this kind of ambition, this kind of joy in accomplishing our ambitions, this kind of joy that we experience from our intellect and our higher faculties. This is the kind of thing that is beyond the capability of a pig, right? So it is these higher joys that he thinks that we should spend all of our time trying to accomplish, right? And if he says, if you doubt this, if you don't think that there are higher joys in life, if you don't think that these things are worth it, there's a really simple test that you can apply. For instance, let's say that right now you're going back to school, you're trying to get a degree so you can get a better job, to fulfill your 5 or 10 year plan to be, financially independent and start a family and so on and so forth. All for it, right? But let's say you have a friend or a cousin who just wants to sit around all day, hitting the bong and playing Call of Duty, right? Lower pleasures, right? And when you hang out with this person, right, often you find yourself in a position of having to defend your lifestyle. You say, I'm killing myself. I'm working really, really hard to do all this stuff, but in the end, it's all going to be worth it. Your friend says to you, man, we got all we need right here. We got Call of Duty. You got some good weed. We got we can have a good time right now. Why worry about 5 or 10 years from now? Why kill yourself and deny yourself all that stuff to accomplish these lofty long-term goals that may never work out for you, right? Now, this might, at moments, sound convincing to you. Mill says, if you ever find yourself doubting whether or not these higher joys in life are worth it, he says what you need to do is you need to ask an expert. Who are the experts? Well, your cousin or your friend who sits around smoking pot playing Call of Duty all day is not the expert. That person has never won a Nobel Prize or created a great art or accomplished his dream job. The real expert is going to be somebody who has experienced both the lower pleasures and the higher pleasures of life, right? Write a letter to, for instance, Barack Obama, right? Barack Obama, by all accounts, spent a lot of time in college, hanging out in the dorm room, hanging out with his friends, smoking some pot and having good times, and then later on went on to accomplish some very, very great things. Write him a letter. Ask him, was it worth it? Was it worth sacrificing in the short and the medium term these sorts of lower pleasures to accomplish the greatest things in life? And his answer will be yes. Mill is confident. Mill didn't know Barack Obama, but he would be confident that anybody who has attained these higher joys in life is going to tell you that they're worth it, right? One thing I want to note about this is that, where we put what in between here, whether or not, seeing a great movie is better than hanging out with friends or vice versa, we don't want to fight too much about that. The main point to be made here is of the extremes, right? The sitting around, doing nothing all day, eating junk food, wasting your time, versus attaining the highest things you're capable of, attaining your highest ambitions and fulfilling your greatest potential, right? When we compare those extremes, that's where Mill says, to the person, the people who have attained their potentials and attained their dreams are going to tell you that it was worth it. And it's no small thing that to attain the highest sorts of joys in life, the highest sorts of accomplishments, we have to put aside a lot of these lower pleasures, right? You have to get up off the couch, turn off the TV, not spend as much time hanging out with your friends if you're going to, get a degree, go on to get your dream job, and so on, right? So there's a amount of sacrifice involved. So, but again, if you're wondering if the sacrifice is worth it, Mill says, ask the expert. The expert is somebody who's experienced both. So, before I forget, the password is popcorn. Popcorn is the password. More lecture to come. Okay, so that is the basics of Mill's version of utilitarianism. The structure of this article is going to be very familiar to you in very short order. He lays out what he believes in the first few pages, and then he spends basically the rest of the article dealing with ways that people have objected to him and why he thinks their objections don't work. Right. What I want to talk about now is a couple of lingering objections that he doesn't consider that have proven to be kind of the ongoing problems that a lot of people have had with utilitarianism, right? You may have heard this example before, but bear with me. You're going to hear it again and again because I'm going to come back to this example again and again. This is a good way to draw a contrast between the three versions of moral realism that we're going to talk about. The example goes like this. Imagine you're a sheriff in the Old West. You find yourself in a position where you have a prisoner in your jail that is accused of a crime, a capital crime, murder. You know that this prisoner is innocent, and you know that when the judge comes around in a couple of weeks, the judge will set him free. But there is an angry mob gathering outside your prison. They think the prisoner is guilty, and they would like you to turn him over to them so they can take him out and lynch him, right? You know this mob, and you know that if you don't turn this prisoner over to them, they are going to start a riot. They're going to go over to the prisoner's side of town. They're going to burn down a building. They are going to kill 50 innocent people, right? So you have this dilemma. Do you turn an innocent man over to the angry mob to prevent the mob from killing 50 innocent people? Or do you stay safe in the jail with the prisoner and let the chips fall where they may outside and the mob do what they do? Now, to head off a couple of details here, you're the only law in this very small town, so you don't have the manpower to go out and prevent the mob. You are safe in the jail. The jail is fortified. They can't get in. The prisoner is not volunteering to be sacrificed. In fact, he's begging you not to take him, not to turn him over to the mob. So you have this dilemma. You have these two choices: turn the innocent man over to the mob, or keep the innocent man safe in the jail with you and let the chips fall where they may outside. Now, I presented this to my ethics class in the last lecture as sort of open-ended question to think about and sort of prime and sort of get them in a ethical sort of mindset. But now let's get to an answer. What advice do we think John? Now in this scenario, you have a deputy, John Stuart Mill, in the prison with you, in the jail with you. What advice do we think that John Stuart Mill would give you? Turn the innocent man over, or keep him safe in the jail? Well, if you've paid attention to this lecture, hopefully it's clear to you that the utilitarian answer is real simple here, right? 1 life versus 50 lives. Out you go, prisoner. Too bad. If there were another way we could figure out to make everybody happy, well, then we would have a moral obligation to do it that way. But if this is really the dilemma, and this is the only two choices, the utilitarian answer is very, very simple. It's just a matter of numbers, right? It's not a matter of justice. It's not a matter of innocence. It's not a matter of whether or not you have a special duty to uphold the laws of the lawman. None of that matters to the utilitarian math. At the end of the day, it's just a numbers game for the utilitarian. You turn the innocent man over, period, right? Or at least that seems to be the very obvious utilitarian answer. Frankly, there's so many varieties of utilitarianism. Maybe there's some other version of utilitarianism that might try to finesse it, but the most obvious utilitarian answer is turn the man over to the angry mob. Now, maybe that's the right answer, maybe it's the wrong answer. When I take a poll of students in my class of who would turn the innocent man over to the mob, I get very, very few students, relatively speaking, who would turn the innocent man over. Most people think that it's just plain wrong, right, to sacrifice an innocent person. And that's the thing with utilitarianism. There's no such thing as just plain wrong. If you're going to say that an act is good or bad for utilitarianism, you have to be able to say, well, why it's good or bad based on the principle of utility and in reference to how much happiness is created, happiness versus misery is created by the act, right? Now, regardless of whether or not you think utilitarianism gets the right answer to this question, this does raise a problem. The problem that a lot of people have with utilitarianism. And that is the degree to which utilitarians are comfortable forcing sacrifices onto a person or a small group of people as long as it redounds in the benefit of the greater good. And this just simply doesn't sit well with a lot of people, particularly people who think that who believe in things like rights, like human rights. Like it would be a violation of my human rights to kill me or take my property away or do something else to me, even if it's going to make a lot of people happy and there's no other way to make those people happy, right? And this counts as sort of the major hitch, the major problem that a lot of people have with utilitarianism, right? To spell it out in a different way, to give another example, the most controversial example of where utilitarianism might get seems to get an answer that everybody thinks is wrong. Forget about the Old West Sheriff for a second. Imagine this. Imagine you're a doctor at a hospital, right? And you see several patients during your day. One of your patients needs a heart. One of your patients needs a kidney transplant. One of your patients needs a new liver. And one of your patients needs courage. I don't know. But you see several different patients who are going to not make it through the night, or at least the next couple of days, unless they have organ transplants, right? So you're doing a double shift, and that night you're working in the ER, right? And while you're in the ER, a young man comes in who has been in a motorcycle accident, who needs a relatively minor surgery to be okay, but you notice that he's filled out his organ donor card, right? And he is he would donate his heart and his liver and his kidneys, everything else your other patients need. If only he would die, right? And so maybe while you're performing surgery on this young patient, you think to yourself about those 5 or 6 other patients upstairs, and you say, maybe I nick an artery. And the patient dies. That's too bad. But let's get those organs upstairs and save some lives, right? Now, you've sacrificed 1 life, but you've saved 5 or 6 lives, right? Utilitarian math seems to be very clear there, right? Even though, bring this scenario up to a utilitarian, and he or she will run out of the room, right? Nobody wants to admit, nobody wants to live in a world where surgeons are making these kinds of decisions on a regular basis and justifying them with utilitarianism. So So, but nonetheless, I mean, that really drives home the bottom line that utilitarians are comfortable with forcing sacrifices on people that make non-utilitarians very uncomfortable and in some cases very, very nervous. So, okay. So what we are going to do next is we are going to talk about a different philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who thinks that every word of utilitarianism is totally wrong. Consequentialism generally, utilitarianism specifically is just wrong, wrong, wrong. Consequences have absolutely nothing to do with good moral decision making. That being a morally good person means always fulfilling your duties to your fellow human beings, and he has a certain way of figuring out what exactly our duties are to other rational beings. So, okay, so thanks for hanging in there, everybody. Let me end by saying that this is no way to do philosophy. There's no way to learn anything, I think, with just sort of these one-way lectures. Particularly, I feel bad about teaching philosophy this way. There's a very old tradition in philosophy going back to Socrates that strongly objects to this sort of like standing here lecturing people and then just dismissing them on their way. I really, really think the way to learn philosophy is with some sort of interaction and questions and answers and so on. So I really, really miss that about teaching philosophy. The best we can do under these circumstances is the discussion boards that are available on Blackboard. I have tried to enter some topics to talk about on the discussion boards. I strongly encourage you to go up there, to check them out, start your own threads, talk about anything related to philosophy or anything else that you want to talk about. You know, there's lots of controversial stuff going on right now in the world. Talk about that if you want. There should be some interaction between human beings involved in this process. And I deeply regret that under the circumstances there aren't. So, yes, it's not for a grade, but just do it because, you know, you like to be educated. Okay, so thanks for hanging in there, and I will see you next time.